What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I'm actually recording in a different audio space, so let me know if you guys hear a difference at all. I'm kind of curious. But we're picking back up with Invincible. And this one basically this is kind of interesting. This deals with a huge change to the Invincible mythos based on what we've known so far, right? So what this initially does, or what I want to do here, is I want to start out where you end up having Cecil having a conversation with Invincible's mom. And the funny thing about this is that Deborah had largely kept the existence of Omni-Kid or Kid Omni-Man, or whatever you want to call him, had largely kept him a secret from Cecil. And this was done for a couple different reasons. The first is because of the fact that, one, she just doesn't trust him, right? That's pretty straightforward based on her experiences dealing with Nolan and so on and so forth, and the fact that he's a government agent. And the second thing is because she's taken this kid to raise. So in a lot of ways, she looks at him as this young boy that she needs to take care of on her own and keep him as safe as she possibly can. And that's why when Cecil shows up here and starts talking about a kind of disappointment about the fact that she didn't tell him what was going on and all that kind of stuff, at the end of the day, her response is, "You're not taking my kid." And that's the thing about Cecil, is this kind of response in turn is, well, we're not really looking to take him, but it's important you understand that after everything that happened with your husband, we are a little weary about him having a child outside of Mark. And then in turn, that child showing up here. We have no idea what this kid is capable of. Now from there, he kind of gets a call where things are basically popping off and going belly up. And then you switch over to Mark meeting with Eve. Now, one of the things we talked about in the previous videos is that Mark's whole romantic interest in Eve is predicated on a couple different things. One, she's hot and they're young, right? Need I say more? Two, when Mark had his escapades where he was kind of running around and dealing with really kind of being thrown through time and so on, that when he encountered the future version of Eve, she begged him, tell me something, right? Like, tell my past self what's going on, whether we're going to date or not going to date, whether you love me, you don't love me, but tell me something, which really showed this idea that Eve was very much interested in Mark. But because she never got a definitive answer, she never moved on. She just stayed hung up on him forever. So the important thing here is that Mark had a kind of conversation with her where he told her that he seemed to be interested, but when she asked where it was coming from, he revealed the truth. And Eve took that personally because it didn't really feel like he was confessing feelings to her because he actually had feelings for her. It seemed like he was doing it because he didn't want her to become the future version that he saw, which really kind of equates to like a pity date. That's really kind of what it came across as. And of course, nobody wants to be a pity date. And so ultimately she kind of took it personally. Now, the fact that she's receptive to having conversations with him and talking to him, and the fact that she's like flying with him, you know, they're kind of going off on superhero stuff, really indicates that, okay, sure, like at the very least, she wants to spend time with him. Otherwise, she would just fly there on her own, right? So obviously there's some kind of interest there. And so once they get to this location whereby Cecil had sent them, the revelation of basically all the Guardians of the Globe who had essentially gone missing are down about 3 miles below. And so once Mark gets down there, what we end up learning is that Doc Seismic had basically kidnapped all of them. Now, the important thing about Doc Seismic, here's the thing about this guy. This guy's basically a stand-in for the Mole Man, right? For those of you guys who don't know who the Mole Man is in Marvel Comics, he leads the Moloids. He's not important, never really was. He was kind of a throwaway character in a lot of different ways. And that's one of the things that kind of gets tossed out here, right? Is that nobody really seems to take him seriously. But the fact that he was able to essentially capture all the superheroes from around the world is a pretty big achievement, right? It's no small thing. Now, of course, Mark comes into the rescue, and that basically offers a momentary distraction, which in turn allows all the various heroes to escape. But then like giant lava monsters, things like that start popping up. So not really anything crazy and out of the ordinary. The big important thing here, this is a significant thing, is that in this moment when Mark is seemingly defeated by the forces of Doc Seismic, that you end up having Cecil, who basically sends in what he calls a secondary team. And this secondary team comes in a couple of different forms. The first bit here comes in the form of the Reanimen, which pretty much all of you guys know by the TV show, right? Like the people who were essentially turned into like robotic kind of cyborg things by D.A. Sinclair. And the second one comes in the form of Darkwing 2. Now, here's the thing. As we know, D.A. Sinclair is working with Cecil, right? That's one of the things that we saw in the previous video that we did, that in the aftermath of D.A. Sinclair doing what he'd done, he was supposed to stand trial and so on and so forth, and instead had been offered a deal by Cecil. We knew that, Mark does not. But Darkwing 2 is a little more interesting. So as you guys know, Darkwing was part of the original Guardians of the Globe who were basically killed by Nolan, by Omni-Man, before he fled Earth. This is essentially his Robin, more or less. The big difference here is that Midnight City is largely where they operate, right? So so Kirkman's not even trying to hide the illusions between Darkwing and Batman, right? They're more or less the same thing. The big issue here, though, is that Darkwing snapped because of how extreme Midnight City was, and because there was so much incredible crime there. And so what he ended up doing was basically killing anybody who committed any crime. It didn't matter what that crime was, from small things all the way to big things. So the fact that he's here is kind of a crazy situation, because Mark's not a huge fan of this guy. And in fact, one of the things that actually goes on is that where Dr. Seismic is doing all these crazy things and so on and so forth, that Darkwing actually ends up leading him, or at least pulling him down into a crevasse, which more or less seems to kill him. And the response of Mark is he immediately freaks out, right? Calls him a murderer and starts pummeling this guy. Now, the big thing about this is that Mark was the only one who witnessed what it was that Darkwing was doing in Midnight City. And so for everybody here who's watching Mark doing what he's doing, at the end of the day, they see it as one of these things where he's basically losing his mind. But from Mark's perspective, this guy's crazy. He's psychotic. He has no business being any kind of a superhero whatsoever. He will always engage in extremely violent actions if he can get away with it. Now, the experience was, or really everything that was kind of happening, was technically documented, and Mark actually goes as far as to say that, like, you guys had to have seen it. It was on the news and recorded and all that kind of stuff, but there's actually a little more craziness going afoot. Instead, what ends up happening is Cecil steps in, tells Mark to stand down, things kind of pop off. He tells Mark, we'll talk about this later. And in turn, Mark has a bit of a conversation with Eve. Not a whole lot going on there, really just kind of talking about how, like, he knows the whole thing with him and Darkwing was essentially recorded. It should have been on the news, all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't. People don't know about it, which means that it seems to have been hidden. And he really seems to believe that Cecil was the one who did it. And so flying directly off to encounter Cecil directly, as the two of them are talking, D.A. Sinclair walks out. And that's when Mark comes to the realization this guy's working with D.A. Sinclair. In a pretty quick situation, we're basically given this revelation on behalf of Mark that nothing Cecil's telling him has really been true, that Cecil's basically been lying all this time. And so one of the things that happens is that Cecil basically leads him into the White Room. Now, as you guys know, that White Room is basically designed in such a way to where it skews with, or really messes with eyesight, so that those people who are in it can't actually see what's in there, right? All they see is basically white. And that's one of the things Mark kind of lets loose into Cecil, right? And it's just like, how could you have possibly worked with somebody like D.A. Sinclair, knowing the kind of things that he's done? And something has to be going on here. Like, you had to have gotten rid of that footage. You had to have done something. Like, you had to have known what was going on with Darkwing, so that now I'm led to believe that you have a hand in the reason why no one's aware of what's going on with Darkwing. Enter all these Reanimen who had basically been built for Cecil by D.A. Sinclair. Now, one of the things that goes on here, Mark just crushes these guys. I mean, and in no uncertain terms, it's quite readily these guys are defeated. And it's one of these things where Cecil almost kind of looks at Mark and talks about, like, Angstrom Levy, right? How Mark had seemingly killed a guy. But the response of Mark is, that was unintentional. It was not my goal to murder a person. But this guy Darkwing does the same thing. This guy D.A. Sinclair, they do the same thing. Like, they experimented on people, killed people, different things like that. Like, they're dark and twisted people. You can't take what is basically an accident and then in turn apply it to the concept that, like, it was an intentional killing of someone. That's not really what was going on. And so that's kind of the crazy thing, is because at the end of the day, the stance of Cecil is, it doesn't matter, right? Like, I've got my hands in everything and I believe I'm genuinely doing the right thing. If you're not with me, you're against me. And that's kind of the crazy thing here, is because Cecil seems to be taking on this exceedingly dark and really absolute standpoint. So much so that once Mark overcomes all these Reanimen and then starts going after Cecil, Cecil panics, takes off, and then there's maybe 500 Reanimen who all kind of exist here. And that's when Mark's kind of like, okay, look, like, are you gonna arrest me? Like, what's gonna happen here? And basically the Reanimen start turning on Mark, and then ultimately Cecil activates this kind of sonic beacon device. And what we end up finding out is that at some point when Mark was given the kind of earpiece by Cecil, that it also had a device inside his body that basically threw off his equilibrium and would emit a sonic pulse. And the reason why this was done is because in his time having dealt with and engaged with Omni-Man, even though they'd worked together for so long, the reality of Cecil and kind of looking at this guy was like, equilibrium is a necessary thing. Because unlike a person where you gave them vertigo, they would get a little dizzy and probably have to sit down. But for somebody like Mark or somebody like Omni-Man, being able to screw with equilibrium in their head is a huge deal, because it's necessary to fly. The sonic pulse is almost just crushing in terms of the sound that it emits, so much so that Mark is largely incapacitated here. And that's kind of the crazy thing, because following that, Mark actually speeds off, right? He kind of asks like, how strong, how capable is this pulse? And then speeds off, where he actually starts to outrace it. Like literally Cecil's teleporting, trying to keep up with him, and then ultimately catches him, and then Mark basically lands inside the headquarters of the new Guardians of the Globe, right? Rex and all those guys, Monster Girl and so on, and basically brings to their attention Cecil's the one that's doing all this. And so it's really the first time that you see people in the superhero community who are learning that Cecil's always been sus, man. There's always been something up with this guy. And that's kind of the crazy thing, is because when he kind of makes this case, that when Mark makes this case that Cecil is employing people who are serial killers or murderers, people who are experimenting on other individuals, somebody like D.A. Sinclair, at the end of the day, it's kind of like yeah, like the whole thing with like Darkwing, that was recorded. That should have been on the news. But because of the connections that Cecil had, he had it suppressed. He basically made sure that nobody would know that Darkwing was doing that stuff. And he basically blackmailed him and said that if you don't work for me directly, I'll release this to the public and the whole world will know that you're basically a crazy psychopath. And that's how he seems to basically get people to work for him. And that leads to the rest of the Guardians of the Globe basically going on and confronting Cecil directly. And that's where things get kind of nuts, because in this process, and this is incredibly important, in this process, Mark begins to lose his control. And this is kind of a dangerous thing here, because as that happens, he starts to become somewhat bloodlusted. Now, the crazy thing about that is this is in a lot of ways kind of where Omni-Man was, but the big difference between Omni-Man and Mark is that Nolan was a guy who'd lived for so long that this idea of him just kind of giving into his emotions was very rare. But Mark does not have the experience and does not have the same kind of training that Omni-Man had, and so it's much easier for him to get into his emotions. And so that's one of the things that kind of happens, is that with everything going on with Mark and this kind of sonic pulse that's ringing through his head, it's on the verge of killing him. And that's when everybody's like, you have to shut that thing down. You're gonna kill Mark. You're gonna kill Invincible. And that's not something that Cecil wants on his conscience. So ultimately, he tells DA to basically shut off the sonic emitter. And then when Mark gets that chance to kind of recoup, he almost kills Cecil. Of course, he doesn't. And then Cecil basically fires him on the spot. And you would think that, you know, when it looks like Mark is just kind of like, okay, fine, we're gonna go ahead and let that go, Mark immediately charges Cecil and then basically says, if we're done, then that means we're done. That means you and I have no contact whatsoever. So if you come near my family, my mom, my brother, or whoever, I will kill you. If you send anybody to my family that I know works on your behalf, or I even get a whiff of the idea that they work on your behalf, I'll come back and I'll kill you. And that's one of the important things, is because what Mark's kind of demonstrated here is that at the end of the day, despite Cecil's best efforts, especially Mark knowing this device is in his brain, that was the ace in the hole, right? That was the only thing that Cecil really had to overcome Mark. Now that that's not there anymore, Mark has the ability to get rid of that, or seems to have the ability to get rid of it, then now Cecil has nothing over Mark. And so if he really does piss him off, Mark will kill him, and there'll be nothing Cecil can do about it. Absolutely nothing at all. He's an old man, right? What could he possibly hope to do against somebody like Mark? Having said that, this is kind of a crazy thing, because Mark has this conversation with Eve, right? Where she kind of hung around the house, you know, just to kind of keep an eye and make sure that Mark was going to be okay when he got back and different things like that. And Mark kind of spills the beans and says, you know, for a moment there, I thought I was going to die. I guess that was really the test, right? For a moment, I thought I was going to die. And in that moment, the only person that I could think of was you. You were the only person I could think of in the whole wide world. And so because of that, I love you. Like I'm with you, like you and me, like that's it. Now, of course, you know, Omni Kid sees it and he's just like, gross. But it's a funny little thing there, right? But following this, there's a couple big things that happen. One of the biggest and most notable things that take place is that Mark takes his younger brother under his wing to train him. Now, as most of you guys can probably guess just from having seen things like Star Wars and so on, this is not going to end well. Mark was as effective of a hero as he is for a bunch of different reasons, the least of which has anything to do with the training that he got from Nolan. We know that just because of the experience the two of them had, and didn't really get any measure of training until his powers developed. The reason why Mark is the way he is because of the time he spent among humanity, right? The time that he spent among people who in almost every conceivable way were weaker than he was. Even before he knew that he had powers, he spent all this time among people and adopted a lot of human tendencies, both good and bad. For somebody like his younger brother, he doesn't have that, right? So it's literally a rush job on training. Taking this kid that has these incredible abilities, who basically gained them, you know, over a decade before Mark did in terms of age relation, and then in turn, taking him under his wing to be his trainer. The other thing about about this is that because of everything that played out with Mark and Cecil, that essentially the Guardians of the Globe have split. The team's roster, as we know it for the most part, is kind of back to its old self, right? In the sense that you've got Monster Girl, you've got Robot, who's now in a boy's body, and so on and so forth, Adam Eve, and those characters, and of course, Mark as well. And then you have the actual Guardians of the Globe, so you've got Duplicate, you've got the Immortal, and so on. But it's one of these things where it's kind of like, okay, like as far as Cecil's concerned, they're the official team, right? The team is really more of like a stand-in team, right? So it's almost kind of an unspoken statement or an unspoken phrase that like they're essentially enemies, right? Like if the team steps in to confront some enemy that the Guardians of the Globe are going to kill and tries to stop them, then now they're enemies, right? They kind of work in that kind of weird capacity there. The other thing that goes on here is, of course, Mark takes his younger brother to meet the tailor, right? And then in turn, the tailor also gives Mark a new costume, which, you know, it looks kind of cool. You know, that's one of those little interesting tidbits there. But the cool thing about this is that you get to this interesting situation where you basically have this kind of nuclear silo that were basically taken over by the Lizard League. And of course, the Lizard League was kind of a laughable team, but the Mauler twins have basically arrived here to kind of do the same thing. Not the exact same thing, but to kind of launch their own plant. Now, this is going to be one of the most important parts of the story because one of the most interesting parts of the story. The way this plays out is that where you have a conversation between Mark and his brother, and the two of them are talking and so on, and he's kind of teaching him the ropes of like, when I tell you to stay, you stay. The threats out here are no joke. This is not a kind of time to mess around or goof off or anything like that. You could get yourself killed facing off against some of the people here, things along those lines. That word basically reaches the ears of Mark that the Mauler twins are attacking this silo, right? And when I say word reaches his ears, I mean like he walks into the room and his mom says like, look at this. And so of course he dons his costume, races off to go face off against the Mauler twins, who have basically defeated the Guardians of the Globe. And so Mark does what he can to step up against them, but then when his brother comes in and he's like, where's Mark at? His mom's like, oh, he went to go do this, and then his brother takes off and joins the fray as well. Now there's a huge difference here, and there's a huge moment here, because ultimately Mark does what he can to face off against these guys, but a nuclear weapon is basically launched, right? The whole idea of the Mauler twins is to basically take over the computer systems of the world, but at the end of the day, like this nuclear missile is launched, which is really designed as a kind of distraction to get Mark out of the scene, and then in turn allow them to complete their goal, but they're totally unaware of his younger brother stepping in. Now, as soon as he shows up, he kind of punches one of the Mauler twins in the mouth, right? They don't really take him seriously. They throw him into a wall. The kid emerges from rubble and then just kind of like flies right through one of them and kills him. This freaks out the other one, right? Because there's this kind of unwritten rule among the superheroes, like you don't kill your villains, right? It's one of these things where the villains are kind of like, I mean, you know how it is. Like we do crime, you arrest us, you take us to jail, and then we get out, and then we do crime again. And it's one of these things where literally one of the twins is like, I give up, I surrender, like please just don't hurt me. And Omni Kid's just like, so you're gonna make it easy for me, huh? And then just like punches his brains out through the top of his head. Now Immortal emerges and sees all this happening, and then Omni Kid is like, it was an accident, right? It was an accident. And this leads to Mark returning and then Cecil arriving at the same time. And as soon as Mark sees Cecil, he immediately goes in for the hit, right? It's just like, I told you to stay away from my family. And that's when Cecil's like, no, we were here to clean up your brother's mess. And realizing what it is that his younger brother had done, the two of them fly into space. This is one of the coolest conversations that we see, because ultimately he tells his younger brother, he's like, you killed those guys. And his younger brother's like, yeah, they were bad guys. Like they killed people down there. I killed them. Now they can't kill anybody else. You should be happy. Now this is sound logic, right? Like they've killed people. They've demonstrated incorrigibility. They will always kill innocent people as long as it allows them to achieve their goal. And so the only logical way to save lives is to kill those guys, right? Because the important thing about this and the big takeaway from that is Mark is sacrificing innocent lives to maintain his own personal morality. Other people's lives are not as important to him as he is to himself. And that's the crazy thing. It's one of the things about superheroes. Nobody ever considers that. The kind of almost narcissistic and psychopathic nature of what it means to be a hero. I and my morality are what are most important to me. And therefore I will sacrifice innocent lives in order to maintain that. The stance of his son is that doesn't make any sense, right? Like if our job is to save people and to keep people protected, then we should kill the bad guys, especially if we know the bad guys are going to routinely kill people. And that's one of the things that he says, you know, when Mark kind of goes on this little bit of a speech and he's like, there are laws and rules, and we can't just take that kind of responsibility for someone else's life, for taking anybody's life. We're not infallible. What if we're wrong and we kill somebody innocent? Well, then what then? And he says, human life is a precious thing. The response of his brother is, no, it's not. And Mark's kind of shocked by that. And his brother's like, precious. Human life is not precious. Not in general, not everyone. People risk their lives every day. They kill each other. If they don't think their lives are important, why should I? Most of them are utterly insignificant. And Mark's response is, you sound like dad. And then his brother's response here is, so? Why is that bad? Why is he so wrong? Did anything he said make sense to you even on a small level? Have you ever thought that maybe our father was right? And that is a mind-blowing moment from this kid, is because at the end of the day, Nolan was right. Right? If humanity really wanted to fix itself, it already would have. It would have been on the road to doing that. But at the end of the day, people do terrible things to each other and other people stand by and watch it happen. And so humanity, as far as Nolan is concerned, and as far as this kid's concerned, and in some level, as far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't say is a lost cause, but is certainly on its death knell, right? And so at the end of the day, it's kind of like humanity needs to be made to be better, even if they don't want to be. And if that means killing criminals in order to save innocent people, then I will do what the average person is unwilling to do. I will do what you are not willing to do. It's kind of it's an amazing philosophy, and it's cool to see it actually said in a comic book because it makes so much logical sense. It makes so much reasonable sense there. It's why I love the philosophy of like superheroes doing superhero things and so on and so forth, because at the end of the day, if you're a superhero, how many innocent lives are you really willing to sacrifice because you don't like the idea of killing bad guys, right? Like how many innocent people? Would you sacrifice 100 lives? Would you sacrifice 500 lives? Well, I mean, is that just the price you pay to maintain your role as a superhero, to keep that high morality? When do you draw the line, right? That's the crazy thing about superheroes. That's what makes it so interesting. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.